Have you ever been in a situation where someone toxic crossed a line with you and you walked away feeling angry at yourself for not knowing how to respond? You replay the conversation in your head, thinking of all the things you should have said, all the ways you should have stood up for yourself, but in the moment you froze, you people-pleased, you let them walk all over you again. What if I told you that Carl Jung discovered something revolutionary about dealing with toxic people that has nothing to do with confrontation, arguments, or drama? Most people think you have two options when dealing with toxic individuals. You either fight back aggressively, creating drama and potentially escalating the situation, or you stay silent and become a doormat. But Jung understood something profound about human psychology that changes everything. He discovered that the most powerful responses aren't loud. They're silent. They're not reactive. They're strategic. They're not emotional. They're psychological. Today, I'm going to share with you 5 silent moves that are so psychologically sophisticated, so subtly devastating, that toxic people will not only regret crossing you, they'll think twice before ever trying it again. These aren't manipulation tactics or revenge strategies. These are applications of deep psychological principles that protect your energy while simultaneously teaching others how to treat you. Jung said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But he also understood that sometimes people aren't irritating us to teach us lessons. Sometimes they're testing our boundaries, probing for weakness, trying to exploit our psychological blind spots. And when that happens, silence isn't golden, it's strategic. What makes these moves so powerful is that they work on the unconscious level. Toxic people are used to getting reactions. They feed on drama, chaos, emotional responses. They know how to handle anger, tears, explanations, justifications. But they don't know how to handle someone who operates from a place of calm psychological authority. Someone who doesn't react emotionally, but responds strategically. These 5 moves will transform you from someone who gets triggered by toxic behavior into someone who becomes completely untouchable. Not because you're cold or cruel, but because you understand psychology better than they do. You understand how their minds work, what they're really after, and how to deny them exactly what they need while maintaining your own power and peace. The first silent move is what Jung would call strategic withdrawal, but I call it the vanishing act. When someone toxic shows their true colors, when they cross a boundary, when they reveal their intention to drain, manipulate, or harm you, you don't argue, you don't explain, you don't try to make them understand. You simply start disappearing from their reality. This isn't about giving them the silent treatment in a This is about recognizing that your attention, your emotional energy, your physical presence are valuable resources that shouldn't be wasted on people who don't appreciate them. Jung understood that attention is the currency of the psyche. When you withdraw your attention from someone toxic, you're literally withdrawing the energy they need to continue their behavior. But here's what makes this move so devastating. You don't announce your withdrawal. You don't say, "I'm done with you," or "I'm not talking to you anymore." You simply become less available. Your responses get shorter. Your availability decreases. Your emotional investment disappears. You fade out of their life like morning mist, so gradually they don't even realize it's happening until you're completely gone. The psychological impact of this is profound. Toxic people are used to getting strong reactions. When you give them nothing to work with, when you become a psychological void instead of an emotional reactor, it creates what Jung called cognitive dissonance. Their usual tactics stop working, but they can't figure out why. They can't point to anything specific you've done wrong, because you haven't done anything. You've simply withdrawn the privilege of your presence. This drives toxic people absolutely insane because they need your reaction to feel powerful. They need your emotional energy to feed their dysfunction. When you stop providing it, when you become unavailable for their drama, they start to panic. They might escalate their behavior temporarily, trying to get a reaction, but when you remain consistently unavailable, they eventually move on to easier targets. The second silent move is what I call psychological mirroring. This is based on Jung's understanding of projection and shadow work. When someone toxic tries to manipulate you, instead of defending yourself or trying to convince them they're wrong, you simply reflect their energy back to them without absorbing it. Let me give you an example. If someone says something passive-aggressive to you, instead of getting defensive or trying to address the passive aggression directly, you respond with complete calm and neutrality. Interesting perspective, you might say, with no emotional charge whatsoever, or simply, okay. Not okay, but, or okay, however, just okay. What this does is it forces them to confront their own energy without having yours to bounce off of. Jung understood that most toxic behavior is unconscious. People project their internal conflicts onto others and then react to those projections. But when you refuse to catch their projection, when you remain neutral and reflective, they're forced to sit with their own psychological material. This is incredibly uncomfortable for toxic people because they're used to externalizing their inner chaos. They're used to making their problems your problems, their emotions your responsibility, their dysfunction your burden. But when you become like a psychological mirror, reflecting their energy back without absorbing any of it, they have to face what they're actually putting out into the world. The beauty of this move is that it's completely unarguable. You're not being mean, you're not being confrontational, you're simply being neutral. But that neutrality is more devastating than any argument because it forces them to confront their behavior without being able to blame you for reacting to it. The third silent move is what Jung would recognize as authentic boundary setting without explanation. Most people, when they set boundaries with toxic individuals, make the mistake of over-explaining, justifying, or seeking approval for their boundaries. They say things like, "I can't do that because," or "I hope you understand that," or "It's nothing personal, but." But toxic people see explanations as negotiations. They see justifications as weaknesses to exploit. They interpret your need to explain as evidence that your boundaries aren't really firm. Jung understood that true psychological authority doesn't explain itself. It simply exists. When you set a boundary with a toxic person, you state it once, clearly and calmly, without justification. "I won't be able to do that. That doesn't work for me. I'm not available for that." Period. No reasons, no apologies, no elaborate explanations about why you can't accommodate their request. This psychological stance communicates something powerful. It says that your boundaries aren't up for debate, negotiation, or approval. They're simply facts about how you operate. And when toxic people encounter this kind of quiet authority, this unshakable certainty about your own limits, they usually back down because they can sense they're dealing with someone who knows their own worth. The fourth silent move is perhaps the most sophisticated psychologically. It's what I call the reality mirror. When someone toxic tries to gaslight you, lie to you, or distort reality, instead of arguing about what really happened, you simply state your experience once and then never discuss it again. Jung understood that toxic people often try to control others by controlling the narrative, by making you doubt your own perception of reality. They'll say things like, "That never happened," or "You're being too sensitive," or "You're remembering it wrong." Most people get trapped in endless arguments trying to prove their version of reality. But here's what's brilliant about the reality mirror approach. When someone tries to gaslight you, you state your experience once, clearly and factually. "I experienced it differently. That's not how I remember it. My perception was different." and then you never argue about it again. No matter how much they push, how much they try to convince you that you're wrong, you simply repeat, "I experienced it differently," and change the subject or walk away. This move is psychologically devastating to toxic people because it denies them the argument they want. They want to pull you into a debate about reality because as long as you're arguing, there's a chance they can make you doubt yourself. But when you simply state your truth once and then refuse to engage in the debate, you maintain your psychological sovereignty while driving them crazy. If you're starting to see how these psychological principles could transform your relationships with difficult people, if you're feeling empowered by the idea of responding from wisdom rather than reacting from emotion, you're discovering what Jung understood about the power of psychological consciousness. There's a community of people learning to apply these deep insights to create boundaries, maintain their energy, and command respect without drama. If you want to dive deeper into Jung's insights about dealing with toxic behavior and maintaining psychological sovereignty, subscribe to the channel. Because understanding how to protect your psychological space is just the beginning of understanding your complete power in relationships. The fifth silent move is what Jung would call conscious indifference, but I call it the art of psychological unavailability. This is different from the vanishing act because you might still have to interact with this person. Maybe they're a co-worker, a family member, someone you can't completely avoid. But you can become psychologically unavailable to their toxicity while remaining physically present. Conscious indifference means you stop being emotionally invested in their opinion of you, their approval, their reactions, their drama. You interact with them the way you might interact with a mildly annoying stranger, polite, functional, but completely detached from any emotional outcome. When they try to push your buttons, you don't have buttons to push anymore. When they try to make you feel guilty, you feel nothing. When they try to manipulate you emotionally, they encounter a psychological wall that they can't penetrate. You become like a smooth stone in a river. The toxic behavior flows around you, but never sticks to you. This is incredibly powerful because toxic people are emotional vampires. They feed on your reactions, your emotions, your investment in their drama. But when you become consciously indifferent, when you stop providing the emotional food they need, they lose interest. It's like trying to have a fight with someone who won't fight back. Eventually it becomes boring, and they move on. Now, here's what makes all 5 of these moves so psychologically powerful. They work because they're based on Jung's understanding of the shadow and projection. Most toxic behavior is unconscious. People are acting out their own unresolved psychological material and trying to make you responsible for it. When you react emotionally, when you get drawn into arguments, when you try to defend yourself or convince them they're wrong, you're actually enabling their unconscious behavior. You're giving them what their shadow needs to continue operating. But when you respond with these silent moves, when you become psychologically unavailable to their projections, you force them to confront their own behavior. The vanishing act forces them to confront the fact that their behavior drives people away. Psychological mirroring forces them to confront their own energy without having yours to blame. Boundary setting without explanation forces them to confront the fact that their manipulation tactics don't work on everyone. The reality mirror forces them to confront the fact that their version of reality isn't the only one. Conscious indifference forces them to confront the fact that not everyone is available for their drama. This is why toxic people will regret crossing you when you use these moves. Not because you've hurt them or gotten revenge, but because you've held up a mirror to their behavior that they can't escape. You've forced them to face the consequences of their toxicity without being able to blame you for those consequences. Jung understood that the most powerful form of response to toxic behavior isn't reaction, it's consciousness. When you respond consciously instead of reacting unconsciously, When you use psychological principles instead of emotional impulses, you become someone that toxic people can't manipulate, can't control, and can't affect. But here's the deeper truth that Jung discovered. These moves don't just protect you from toxic people. They transform you into someone who naturally commands respect. When you stop being available for drama, when you stop absorbing other people's projections, when you set boundaries without explanation, when you maintain your reality regardless of others' attempts to distort it, when you become consciously indifferent to manipulation, you develop what Jung called psychological authority. Psychological authority isn't about dominating others. It's about being so grounded in your own truth, so clear about your own worth, so unavailable for psychological games, that people naturally treat you with respect. Not because they fear you, but because they can sense that you're someone who knows their value and won't accept less than they deserve. This is why these moves are so much more powerful than reactive responses. When you react emotionally to toxic behavior, you're operating from the same level as the toxic person. You're meeting unconsciousness with unconsciousness, drama with drama, toxicity with toxicity. But when you respond with these conscious moves, you're operating from a higher level. You're meeting unconsciousness with consciousness, drama with calm, toxicity with wisdom. And here's what's beautiful about this approach. It's not about becoming cold or cruel. It's about becoming conscious and boundaried. You can still be kind, compassionate, and generous with people who deserve it. But you no longer waste those precious qualities on people who would exploit them. Jung said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is a reaction, both are transformed. But when you use these silent moves, you control the reaction. You decide what kind of transformation occurs. You become the conscious element in the interaction, and consciousness always wins over unconsciousness in the long run. The vanishing act teaches toxic people that their behavior has consequences. Psychological mirroring teaches them that their energy is their responsibility. Boundary setting without explanation teaches them that not everyone is available for manipulation. The reality mirror teaches them that their version of reality isn't universal. Conscious indifference teaches them that their drama isn't compelling to everyone. These are profound psychological lessons that most toxic people have never encountered, because most people react emotionally instead of responding consciously. When you become someone who responds with these kinds of sophisticated psychological moves, you become someone who can't be manipulated, controlled, or exploited. But perhaps most importantly, you become someone who doesn't need to be cruel or aggressive to command respect. You don't need to fight fire with fire because you understand that consciousness is more powerful than chaos, that wisdom is more effective than warfare, that psychological authority is more compelling than emotional reactivity. This is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. Part of that process involves learning to protect your psychological space, to maintain your boundaries, to respond from wisdom rather than react from emotion. When you develop these capabilities, you don't just become immune to toxic people. You become someone who naturally attracts healthy relationships and repels unhealthy ones. Toxic people are drawn to emotional reactivity because that's what they need to feed their dysfunction. But they're repelled by psychological consciousness because it forces them to confront their behavior. When you become someone who operates from consciousness rather than reactivity, you naturally filter out people who would exploit you and attract people who can appreciate your depth. The regret that toxic people feel when they cross someone who uses these moves isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about the natural consequence of encountering someone who won't enable their unconscious behavior. It's the regret of realizing they've lost access to someone valuable because they couldn't treat that person with respect. And that regret becomes a teacher. forcing them to either grow or move on to easier targets. Either way, you win. Either they become better people through encountering your boundaries, or they remove themselves from your life by seeking easier victims. Both outcomes protect your energy and preserve your peace. So the question becomes, are you ready to stop being available for toxic behavior? Are you willing to develop the psychological sophistication to respond consciously instead of react emotionally? Are you prepared to become someone who commands respect, not through aggression, but through consciousness? Because when you master these 5 silent moves, when you become psychologically unavailable for drama, manipulation, and toxicity, you don't just protect yourself from difficult people. You become someone who naturally creates healthy, respectful relationships because you've learned to value yourself enough to require others to do the same. The toxic people who cross you will regret it, not because you've punished them, but because they've lost access to someone who could have enriched their life if they had known how to treat you with respect. And that regret, that natural consequence of toxic behavior, becomes the teacher that either transforms them or removes them from your experience. Either way, you maintain your power, your peace, and your psychological sovereignty. And that, according to Jung, is the foundation of a life lived consciously, authentically, and free from the chaos that unconscious people try to create around them.